The fluorescent lights hummed overhead like they always did, a sound so constant that Laura Bennett had stopped hearing it 3 years ago. The smell of antiseptic and stale coffee hung in the corridor outside room for 47 at Seattle General, mixing with something else, the metallic scent of fear that came off trauma patients before they understood what had happened to their bodies. She'd learned to read that smell the way other people read faces. Laura moved through the trauma ward with the kind of quiet efficiency that made her nearly invisible. Not timid. Invisible by design. Her hands moved across the vital sign monitor with practiced precision, adjusting the blood pressure cuff on the new admission's left arm, checking the 4 lines she'd started 40 minutes ago with a single smooth insertion, no fumbling, no second attempts. The patient, a man in his early 40s with the carved-out look of someone who'd spent years in a gym that didn't have mirrors, watched her work without speaking. Room for 47. Navy SEAL. Training accident. Requested the best trauma specialist in the building. That last detail had come through the admissions nurse with the kind of emphasis that meant the patient had made demands, not requests. Laura was used to that. Men like this didn't ask. They commanded. She reached for his wrist to check the radial pulse, strong, steady, perhaps slightly elevated, but nothing concerning for someone who'd just arrived from a training scenario gone wrong. His forearm caught her eye. The tattoo ran down the inside of his arm in clean military lettering, L. Bennett. She kept her expression level, the way she kept everything level, and counted the beats in her head. 68. Normal. Pulse is good, she said, keeping her voice at the neutral register she'd perfected over 12 years, though 3 of those years had been at Seattle General, and 9 years before that were locked away behind classified doors she could no longer access. Pain level right now. Manageable, the SEAL said. His eyes tracked hers for a moment, searching her face the way people sometimes did when they thought they recognized someone. Then nothing registered. He looked away. She waited for something, a flicker of memory, a narrowing of his eyes, but it didn't come. The scar tissue on her left shoulder, hidden under her scrubs, remained hidden. The calluses on her palms from things that had nothing to do with 4 lines stayed unremarkable. She was exactly what she appeared to be, a floor nurse with steady hands and a quiet competence that nobody bothered to notice. She finished the vital signs assessment and made a note on his chart. Baseline stable. The orthopedic surgeon would be by within the hour to evaluate the shoulder injury from his training scenario. Nothing emergency. Nothing requiring immediate intervention. Just a SEAL who'd asked for the best and gotten assigned to the trauma ward where the best were supposed to be. The best were in the form of Dr. Richard Caldwell, the trauma chief who was currently reviewing patient charts in his office at the end of the corridor. Laura had never heard him called Richard by anyone. He was always Dr. Caldwell, and that title carried the kind of weight that came from having the right connections and the right confidence, the kind of weight that had nothing to do with how many lives he'd actually saved and everything to do with how many people owed him favors. From her position at the vital signs monitor, Laura could see him through the glass partition of his office. Caldwell sat with his back straight, his desk arranged with the precise geometry of someone who believed that external order reflected internal superiority. His suit was Italian, probably $4,000, with a tie that had cost more than Laura's entire monthly rent. He was typing something, emails, likely, to board members or administrators or the other attendings who formed his orbit. People who didn't question him. People who benefited when he benefited. She'd figured out the operation by month 2 at Seattle General. The pattern wasn't subtle if you knew how to read patterns. Unnecessary procedures. Imaging ordered twice when once would suffice. Consultations that billed separately for what could have been handled by a floor nurse. Patients who came in for one thing and somehow ended up admitted for 3 others, each with its own billing code, each funneling money through a shell consulting company that existed for no other purpose than to separate hospital revenue from hospital records. Laura had never said anything. Saying things required visibility, and visibility was dangerous. Visibility meant questions. Questions led to answers that nobody with power wanted answered. So she kept her hand steady, her observations to herself, and her eyes on the work that actually mattered, the patients who came through the doors confused and frightened and broken. The door to room for 47 opened and she turned, expecting the orthopedic resident. Instead, Caldwell stood in the doorway, his presence seeming to increase the air pressure in the small space. He was the kind of man who made rooms smaller when he entered them, not because of his physical size, he was lean, almost elegant, but because of the certainty he carried with him. The certainty that he deserved to take up whatever space he wanted and that everyone else would make room. His eyes moved from the seal to Laura, and something calculated shifted across his face. Not contempt, exactly. Something more strategic than that. He was assessing her the way he assessed everything, not for what it was, but for what it could be made to become if you applied pressure in the right places. Master Chief Bennett, Caldwell said, reading the chart with a slight smile that didn't involve his eyes. Navy background. The SEAL glanced at Laura, then back to Caldwell. SEAL Team 3. Charlie Platoon. Impressive, Caldwell said, though his tone suggested he'd heard impressive credentials before and remained unimpressed. He was the kind of doctor who believed that medical training conferred dominance over every other form of expertise, including the kind that came from being trained to operate in hostile territory. You'll be in excellent hands. Our trauma team is among the top 3 in the Southeast. He said our team while looking at Laura without really looking at her, the way you look through glass to what's beyond it. She had become very good at being transparent. That's good to hear, the SEAL said. Caldwell turned to leave, then paused at the door. Bennett, he said, addressing Laura directly for the first time. After you finish here, I'd like you to assist with the rounds this afternoon. We're going to be teaching some of the residents about triage protocol. He said it the way someone might say they'd like you to attend a firing squad. I think your current procedures might provide an excellent example of what we're trying to move away from. He left before she could respond. In the silence that followed, the monitor beside the SEAL's bed beeped once, just the normal rhythm it had been maintaining all along, unchanged and reliable. That sounded like a threat, the SEAL said quietly. Laura finished writing her notes. Her handwriting didn't waver. No, she said. That was just Dr. Caldwell being efficient. She placed his chart back on the holder at the foot of his bed and moved toward the door, but the SEAL's voice stopped her. You ever get the sense, he said, that someone's trying to figure out if you're dangerous? She didn't turn around. All the time, she said. Some of us are harder to read than others. The fluorescent lights above Grand Rounds cast everything in the color of old bone. 20 residents stood in a tight semicircle around the bed, tablets in hand, waiting. Laura Bennett adjusted the monitor leads on her patient's chest and stepped back, giving them space, the way she always did. She was invisible here. That was the point. Dr. Caldwell entered at 10:16 a.m., his white coat crisp enough to stand on its own, his leather shoes catching light like dark water. He'd been looking for her all morning. She could feel it the way you feel someone watching from the tree line. Ah, Nurse Bennett. His voice carried the tone of a man who'd just noticed something unpleasant on his shoe. Perhaps you can explain your charting decisions on this patient. Room for 41. Laura stepped forward. 20 pairs of eyes turned toward her. The patient presented with chest pain and dyspnea, she said quietly. Vitals were stable. I documented the EKG findings and... You documented, Caldwell interrupted, his voice dropping into a register that made several residents shift their weight. Rather than consulted. Rather than escalated. You made a clinical judgment call that a floor nurse has absolutely no business making. He looked at the residents like they were shareholders and she was a line item. This is what outdated triage protocols look like. Nurse Bennett comes from a background where resources didn't exist, so she still believes she can manage complex presentations with basic observation. The silence stretched. One resident looked at his shoes. Another cleared his throat. She belongs in a rural clinic, Caldwell continued, his voice now sweet as rotted fruit. Not in a trauma center. Not on my unit. He turned to face her directly. You understand that, don't you? Laura's jaw clenched. Once. Barely perceptible. Her hands remained at her sides, steady as surgical steel. She didn't blink. Didn't step back. Didn't speak. She simply waited for him to finish, the way you wait for rain to stop. Caldwell's eyes narrowed slightly. He'd expected something, a flush of embarrassment, an apology, tears perhaps. The absence of any reaction seemed to irritate him more than if she'd argued. He turned away, dismissing her with a gesture, and continued his rounds with the residents trailing like remeras behind a shark. Laura returned to her charting station and pulled up the next patient's file. Her hands moved with the same deliberate precision they always did. No tremor. No hesitation. Just the muscle memory of someone who'd spent 14 years making decisions under pressure where mistakes meant body bags. At 2:13 p.m., she found herself in front of the vending machine on the 3rd floor. She was feeding a dollar bill into the slot when she heard them around the corner. 2 attendings. Both men. Both wearing the kind of expensive watches that announced how little their salaries came from hospital work. Nurse Bennett's got some remedial education going on, one of them said, his voice muffled by the sound of the machine accepting change. Did you hear Caldwell during grand rounds? Rural clinic material. Honestly, where do they find these people? The other man laughed. A sharp, barking sound like a seal clapping. She probably learned her protocols at some community college. Probably thinks triage is still done with clipboards and prayers. Laura's hand paused on the vending machine button. She could have announced her presence. Could have turned the corner. Instead, she waited, letting the moment crystallize. This was information. In a previous life, she'd called it situational awareness. Now she just called it knowing where the threat came from. She pressed the button. The mechanism whirred. A bag of pretzels tumbled down. She retrieved it slowly, deliberately, and only then did she turn and walk back down the hallway, passing the 2 men on her way out. They didn't notice her. She was already invisible by then. By 4:38 p.m., she'd completed her rounds on floors 2 and 3. She was checking a patient's for drip-in room for 47 when Dr. Caldwell appeared in the doorway, his silhouette blocking the afternoon light that came through the window. Behind him stood a security guard in a dark uniform, thumbs hooked through his belt loops. Nurse Bennett. A word, please. She finished adjusting the fluid rate and stepped away from the bed, moving toward him with the same unhurried pace she used for everything. The guard shifted his weight. Caldwell's face had taken on the color of someone who'd been rehearsing this moment in his head. Your performance metrics continue to decline, he said, his voice low enough that the patient in the bed couldn't hear but loud enough to make his point. Your clinical judgment is questionable. Your charting is sloppy. And frankly, you're creating a safety risk for this unit. Laura looked at him directly. Not through anger. Not through fear. Just observation. The way a sniper watches a target. If you cannot meet the basic standards of a trauma nurse, Caldwell continued, then I'm going to have security escort you out of this building. Is that clear? Understood, doctor, she said. 8 words. Calm as still water. I'll improve my performance. He'd expected more. Another apology perhaps. More deference. Instead, she simply nodded and moved past him, returning to room for 47, where she continued adjusting before as if he were already gone. The security guard waited in the hallway for 30 seconds, then followed Caldwell back toward the elevators. The patient in room for 47 was a Navy SEAL named Marcus Chen. He had a 3-week-old training injury and a tattoo on his forearm that read Bennett in black ink that had faded from exposure to Afghanistan sun and time. He watched her work from his hospital bed, something shifting in his expression, not quite recognition, but the ghost of it, the way your brain sometimes catches a scent that means nothing until years later when you realize it meant everything. You're good at that, he said quietly. Adjusting lines. You do it like you've done it 1,000 times. Laura didn't pause. Her hands remained steady. 8 years of practice, she said. Nothing more. But that wasn't the worst part. That wasn't what made her look away from his eyes and toward the window, where the Atlanta afternoon had turned gray with the promise of rain. The worst part was knowing exactly why he couldn't see her face beneath the fluorescent lights and the present moment. The worst part was understanding that the man she'd carried 3 miles through mortar fire at Bagram was lying in front of her with her own name written on his arm, and she couldn't let him know she was still alive. The monitor flatlined. Not a single beep. Not a rhythm. Nothing but a stray green line and the kind of silence that kills faster than any bullet. Marcus Chen's chest stopped moving. His skin went from olive to ash in the span of a breath, and the surgical resident working the exploratory wound froze with his hand still inside the open cavity, fingers trembling around a bleeder that had just let go. "He's exsanguinating," someone whispered. Dr. Caldwell didn't move. He stood at the head of the table in his custom surgical loops, watching the monitors like they were displaying stock prices instead of a human being bleeding out, and for 3 full seconds, 3 seconds Laura counted in her head like a sniper counting down artillery, nobody did anything. The attending froze. The residents froze. The scrub tech stared at the blood pooling on the sterile field like it was someone else's emergency. The exploratory was Caldwell's idea. Unnecessary. Laura had flagged it during pre-op rounds, pulled the chart 3 times in 6 hours, saw the imaging that showed no indication for surgical intervention. But Caldwell had ordered it anyway, signed it without consulting the radiologist, and now his scalpel had nicked the right common iliac artery during what was supposed to be a routine inspection of abdominal trauma that didn't exist. Blood loss at this rate, 90 seconds until cardiac arrest. Laura moved before her mind caught up to her hands. She didn't ask. Didn't request. Muscle memory from Bagram and 3 other deployments took the wheel. She was already moving toward the scrub sink, already calling out without raising her voice, the way operators spoke in the middle of gunfire, clear and authoritative and absolutely certain. "I'm going in. Get me a size 7 glove and a 14-gauge angiocath needle. Now." The scrub tech flinched at the command in her voice. Not a question. Not a please. The same tone she'd used once to tell a lieutenant colonel to stand down during a hostage extraction, the same frequency she'd used calling in medevac under fire. The tech moved without thinking, grabbed the needle, started setting up. Caldwell's head snapped toward her like she'd just materialized from another dimension. His face was already darkening, his mouth opening to say something that would have involved security and insubordination and the kind of threats that end careers. But Laura was already scrubbing, fast, efficient, the kind of scrub that takes 45 seconds instead of 3 minutes because time had become a ticking clock and she could feel it down to her spine. "You are not cleared to," Caldwell started. "Step back," Laura said. Not to him. To the resident. To the attending. To everyone. The words landed like an order, and 6 years of wearing scrubs instead of tactical gear evaporated like morning dew. Everyone who isn't actively stabilizing him moves back 2 feet. Now. She was in the field. She could feel it in her body now, the shift from civilian to operator, the sudden clarity that came when stakes stopped being theoretical. 80 seconds. The attending fumbled stepping back. The resident's hand was still in the wound and Laura reached past him with a presence that made people instinctively make room, the way animals part for an apex predator. The wound was a catastrophe. The resident had nicked the iliac, but not just nicked it, torn it. 2 centimeters of arterial damage with blood coming like a dark fountain, pooling across organs, running toward the surgeon's field markers that were already saturated and useless. Caldwell had packed the wrong side. The resident was applying pressure in 3 locations that meant nothing while the real bleed was 2 inches deeper, out of reach, out of sight. Laura didn't explain. Didn't narrate. Hand steady as a surgical laser, she positioned the angiocath at the second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line, the teaching position for emergency needle decompression, except Marcus didn't need air. Marcus needed blood. Marcus needed a closed chest incision open fast enough that she could get direct access to the wounded artery before his heart decided it was done. The scalpel was in someone's hand, the attending, moving on instinct to follow the clear command structure. Laura took it and made the cut. Not hesitant. Not surgical careful. Fast and deep, through skin and fascia, opening the left anterolateral thoracotomy in a line that would give her access to his heart and the damaged vessels. Left atrial retractor. Small, she said. And I need fresh blood. Oh, positive if you have it, uncrossed, running wide open. Now. The nurses were moving. Not confused anymore. Confused people died. These people were watching someone who knew exactly what she was doing, and that certainty was contagious. The retractor appeared. Laura positioned it and opened the chest cavity, the ribs spreading like she was opening a locked door, and there it was, the heart, still and useless, tissue pale in the overhead lights. 70 seconds. Her hands moved into position. Left hand supporting the heart from behind. Right hand positioned for direct compression. This wasn't what they taught in nursing school. This wasn't the sterile, controlled version from textbooks and simulation labs. This was battlefield medicine, 3 miles through mortar-fire medicine, the kind where you opened a chest with your bare hands because the alternative was watching someone die while you followed protocol. She began compressions. Not the gentle compressions of standard CPR. Direct cardiac massage. Pump and release. Pump and release. Squeezing the muscle itself, forcing blood through chambers that had forgotten how to work. Her hands, small, scarred at the knuckles from old operations, calloused in ways nurses weren't supposed to be calloused, did the work of a failing organ. Epinephrine, 1 milligram for push, she said. Then, give me a sinus rhythm. Come on, Marcus. Not today. The monitor responded before the medication even reached his bloodstream. 1 beep. 1 small flutter of electrical activity. Compress, the attending said, and Laura realized he wasn't talking to her anymore. He was talking to the room, following her lead because she'd become the only person whose voice mattered. She'd become the person who knew what came next. Another compression. Another squeeze of the heart muscle. The monitor climbed in small jumps, 40 beats per minute. Irregular. Struggling. But present. Push another epi, Laura said. Check the field for more bleeding. The resident was already looking, already pointing to where the iliac artery was starting to stabilize now that Marcus's heart was generating pressure again. The bleeding had slowed. Not stopped. Not yet. But slowed. 60 seconds had passed. Then 70. Then 80. The monitor climbed again, 62 beats per minute. The rhythm was irregular but strengthening, like a heart remembering how to work. Oxygenation. Laura didn't take her hands off the compressions. O2 sat 68 and rising. 72. 79, someone called out. Laura could place the voice, one of the junior residents, young enough to still sound surprised by emergency medicine, old enough to understand what he was witnessing. 85. 88. The rhythm improved, 90 beats per minute. The heart was pumping now, actually pumping, responding to direct pressure and medication and the fact that someone in this room knew exactly what they were doing. 92, the resident continued. 94. 98. Stable. 102. Holding. The heart beneath her hands was working again. Not perfect. Not normal. But working. Laura could feel it, the actual squeeze and release of living tissue, and for one moment, just one, she allowed herself to remember the exact same sensation in the middle of a firefight outside Bagram, hands on a different chest, pressure on a different wound, a different soldier on his way to extraction. A soldier who'd lived because she didn't stop when everyone else did. She slowly released pressure. Waited. The rhythm didn't collapse. The monitor held steady. Get me a vascular clamp and a closure pack, she said. We need to control the iliac before we close. Satin sky clamp if you have it. And get me a 2-0 silk for suturing. The attending was moving now, actually competent now that the crisis had settled into something that looked like surgery instead of a code. The room had reorganized itself around her, and nobody, not the residents, not the scrub tech, not the nurses standing at the field's edge, was looking at Laura anymore. They were looking at the monitor and the heart and the steady climb of numbers that meant a Navy SEAL had come back from whatever edge he'd been standing on. 95 seconds. That's all it had taken. The room was working now, flowing, efficient, the kind of coordinated emergency response that happened when everyone accepted a single authority. The clamp was in her hand. The sutures were being prepared. The wound was being packed with fresh gauze, the bleeding finally slowing to something manageable. Laura tied off the artery with movements that had no hesitation in them. 2 throws. 3 throws. The bleeding stopped. The field stabilized. Marcus Chen's heart pumped on, irregular but steady, his oxygen saturation holding at 94%, his color slowly returning from ash gray to something approaching human. And then it was over. The crisis shifted. The attending stepped in with the closure. The residents began documenting. The scrub tech started passing instruments for the systematic closure that always felt anticlimactic after the chaos. Laura stepped back from the table, and her hands were shaking. Not from fear. Not from doubt. From adrenaline, from the sudden absence of ticking clocks, from the decompression that happened when the body realized it could finally rest. She pulled off her gloves with careful precision and turned toward the sink, and that's when she saw Dr. Caldwell watching her from the other side of the operating theater. His face had gone very still. Not surprised. Not grateful. Calculating. The way a man looked when his carefully constructed world had just been exposed to someone he'd underestimated, someone he'd tried to humiliate, someone whose hands had just done something he couldn't explain and wouldn't forget. He didn't say anything. Didn't move. Just watched as Laura washed the blood from her hands, watched as she stripped out of the surgical gown with movements that carried absolutely no doubt in them, watched as she walked toward the door with the kind of walk that came from having carried wounded soldiers through desert combat. The attending called after her, Bennett, that was, but she was already through the doors, already in the hallway, already watching the operating theater recede behind her like a door closing on something that shouldn't have been opened. Her hands trembled slightly as they moved into the sink. Just once. Just for a moment. The second someone saw her check a monitor outside room for 47, they would have questions. The second anyone asked what she'd just done, where she'd learned that technique, why she knew to position the retractor before anyone asked her to, things would start unraveling. But that wasn't the worst part. Not even close. The cardiac monitor screamed flatline. For 95 seconds, Laura's hands moved like they remembered something her mind couldn't admit. Direct cardiac massage. Open chest. Blood on her palms. And when the rhythm came back, sinus rhythm, beautiful and steady, the operating room went dead silent. 20 people staring. Caldwell's face pale as the overhead lights. Marcus Chen alive because a floor nurse had just performed a procedure that belonged to surgeons, not to anyone carrying a clipboard and a vague hospital ID. She peeled off her gloves without waiting for dismissal. Walked out. Left him standing there, his mouth opening and closing like a fish pulled from water, trying to understand what he'd just witnessed. But that wasn't the worst part. Caldwell moved fast. Strategic. Not the type to yell or threaten, that wasn't his style. He was a network man. A favor man. A phone call during someone's golf game kind of man. The hospital board president took the call on the 14th hole, listening while his foursome waited, listening while Caldwell explained that a floor nurse had violated every protocol in the building, had scrubbed into a surgical bay without authorization, had performed an invasive procedure that could have gotten the hospital sued into bankruptcy. The president said he'd look into it. Caldwell said he hoped someone would look into it very soon. Then came the references. Caldwell had Laura's file from Seattle General's HR, 3 years prior, the hospital where she'd worked before Atlanta. He called the nursing director at 2:13 p.m., planted a seed about Laura's instability issues, asked if she'd noticed any concerning behavior during her tenure, mentioned something about erratic judgment calls, didn't push too hard because that wasn't how you did it. Just let the implication settle. The director said she didn't recall any major issues, but Caldwell thanked her for her candor and hung up. By 2:27 p.m., he'd made 3 more calls. By 3:36 p.m., he had an investigator on retainer, external, outside the hospital's normal channels, someone who specialized in finding grounds for immediate termination. Someone who understood how to build a case. Laura sat in the break room, hand steady around a cup of cooling coffee she wasn't drinking. She knew what was coming. The recognition in Marcus's eyes when he woke up, not who she was, but that she was something other than what she appeared. The questions people would start asking. The record someone would inevitably try to pull. She couldn't defend herself. That was the part that carved at her chest like a scalpel through tissue. Naval intelligence had been clear back when they ordered her to disappear after Bagram went sideways. After the operation became political liability. After 3 members of Congress decided a classified extraction had become classified liability. They erased her service record entirely. Master Chief Petty Officer Laura Bennett ceased to exist in any official capacity. They gave her a new name, a social security number that traced back to nothing, a blank slate, and an order, surface in military circles, and they'd prosecute her for espionage. Violate the NDA and she'd lose everything. The military had given her a choice between 2 graves and told her to pick the one she could live in. So when the termination letter arrived by courier at 5:42 p.m., effective immediately, violating surgical protocol, unauthorized medical intervention, grounds for immediate dismissal, she signed the acknowledgement form without reading it twice. The courier watched her sign, professional and neutral, handing her a copy like this was something people did every day. Fire the nurse who'd saved a life. Burn the bridge. Destroy the evidence. She cleared her locker in silence. Badge. Stethoscope. The small framed photo of her daughter, Emma, age 8, gapped smile from school pictures. 3 pairs of shoes. And at the bottom, wrapped in an old washcloth, the tarnished military challenge coin she'd carried for 16 years. She held it in her palm, felt the weight. Engraved on one side, Kandahar Angel. On the reverse, coordinates and a date. Bagram, 2011. She'd never looked at it in a fluorescent-lit break room before. Never had reason to. The coin stayed in the car, in a duffel bag buried under winter clothes, a thing from before. A ghost's keepsake. Her daughter found her 2 hours later at the kitchen table in their apartment. 6:13 p.m. Still light outside, that particular quality of Atlanta autumn where the sun stretches and the shadows grow long. Emma came home from her grandmother's place. Laura's mother had picked her up from school like always, and the first thing she noticed was her mother sitting still. Just sitting. No dinner. No movement. Just Laura with her face in her hands, tears running silently down her cheeks in a way that Emma had never seen before. Mom. Laura looked up. Wiped her face with the heel of her hand. The tears came again immediately, which was worse somehow. Hi, baby. Why are you home early? Laura couldn't explain. Couldn't say the hospital had terminated her for saving someone's life. Couldn't say that the people she'd served had ordered her to disappear and now she was disappearing, forced into a smaller life, a quieter existence, a place where no one would ever look at her and see what she actually was. Couldn't say any of that to an 8-year-old who still believed the world made sense. I just needed a day, Laura said. Come here. Emma climbed into her lap like she used to when she was smaller. Laura held her, felt the small heartbeat against her ribs, and thought about how this was the only identity that mattered anymore. Mother. The rest, Master Chief, Operator, the woman who'd carried wounded soldiers through burning compounds, all of that was gone. Erased. Classified. Dead. By 7:38 p.m., Emma was asleep on the couch. By 8:16 p.m., Laura had the challenge coin in her hand again, alone in the kitchen, staring at those engraved coordinates like they might tell her something. Might give her permission to stop fighting. She was a ghost. That's what they'd called her. The one thing the military had called her that she'd actually earned. The phone on the kitchen counter buzzed once. Unknown number. She didn't answer. It buzzed twice more. Then silence. Then the sound that changed everything. The sound was distant at first. A rhythmic pulse cutting through the Atlanta night air. Growing louder. The unmistakable percussion of rotor blades displacing air with military precision. Laura moved to the window. Through the glass, she watched a Black Hawk helicopter descend toward the parking lot below, running lights cutting through the darkness like a surgical laser through tissue. Then another. Then a third. The rotor wash sent debris spiraling across the asphalt. Car alarms began wailing. And she knew, with the absolute certainty of someone who had trained for exactly this kind of moment, that they had finally come for her. She set the challenge coin on the kitchen table. Beside Emma's homework. Beside the bills she couldn't pay. Beside the life she'd built in the spaces between who she'd been and who she was allowed to be. Then she walked to the door and waited. 3 days later, a gurney rolled through the emergency bay doors with a Syrian national, male, 34, GSW to the lower left abdomen, blood pooling beneath him like a question mark nobody wanted to answer. The nurses moved with practiced efficiency, cut the clothes, start 2 large bore 4s, type and cross for 6 units. Laura wasn't supposed to be there. She'd cleared her locker 48 hours ago, boxed up the things that mattered, her stethoscope, her certifications, the tarnished challenge coin from Bagram pressed against the bottom like a secret. But she'd come back to pick up the final paycheck, the one the hospital owed her for unused vacation days, and she was walking past the trauma bay when she heard the attending say the words that changed everything, "We're going to lose him." She stopped. Hands already moving before her brain could argue. The trauma surgeon looked up as she pushed through the bay doors, his expression shifting from confusion to relief in the span of a heartbeat. She didn't waste time explaining. She was already scrubbed, gloved, reading the monitor, BP 86/52, O2 sat dropping, heart rate climbing past 140. The kind of numbers that meant somebody's clock was running out. The Syrian man's eyes opened. Locked onto her face. His body went rigid beneath the surgical lights. "Hayalet," he whispered in hoarse Arabic, his voice a rasp of disbelief. "Ghost." The room didn't go silent. The room went still. Ventilators kept their mechanical rhythm. Monitors kept their beeping. But every human being in that trauma bay stopped moving. Stopped thinking. Because Ghost was a code name the insurgents of Bagram had whispered in compounds where Americans never came out alive. Ghost was the operator who'd extracted 3 hostages from a fortified position and left 17 militants with no explanation and no survivors. Ghost was a myth. A story fighters told in the dark to explain why their compounds fell. And Ghost was standing in their trauma bay in blue scrubs with a stethoscope around her neck. A veteran security guard, former Marine, judging by his posture and the way he'd positioned himself at the doorway, stepped forward. His voice cut through the silence like a parade ground command. "Master Chief Petty Officer," he said. The words hit the room like a defibrillator paddle. Not a question. A statement. An announcement. A recognition. Laura's jaw tightened. Once. Barely perceptible. Then she turned back to the bleeding man on the table and got to work. Within the hour, hospital administration had assembled in the boardroom, and a 2-star general walked through the doors with a classified file thick as a phone book. His voice was measured, precise, the kind of control that only comes from men who've made life-or-death decisions in languages most Americans never heard spoken. He opened the file. Started reading. Master Chief Petty Officer Laura and Bennett, assigned to Joint Special Operations Command, 3 tours, multiple commendations, and an operation in Helmand Province that had been so thoroughly erased from the record that the Pentagon had officially declared she'd never existed. The board members' faces went through transformations. Confusion. Recognition. Horror. Marcus Chen walked into that room in his hospital gown, still wearing the 4 lines, still weak enough that a nurse had to steady him at the doorway. But his eyes were clear. His jaw set. He reached down and rolled up his sleeve, exposing the tattoo that covered most of his bicep, the name L. Bennett in military stencil lettering, surrounded by the coordinates of the extraction point. His voice came out steady, the voice of a man who'd already survived things that would break most people. 3 miles, he said. That's how far she carried me and Petty Officer Jackson when our unit got ambushed outside Sanjin. Mortar fire. Contact from 3 directions. She wrapped Jackson's leg tourniquet herself, found us in the dark, and moved us both to the extraction zone while taking fire. He paused. Looked directly at Dr. Caldwell. I got out because of her. So did Jackson. So did the 3 hostages she extracted on her own after that. The room stayed silent for exactly 10 full seconds. Everyone's eyes turned to Dr. Caldwell at the same moment, like a flock of birds sensing danger. His face was doing something strange, jaw clenching, unclenching, color draining like someone had opened a valve. But that wasn't the worst part. The forensic accountant Caldwell had demanded, the one he'd hired to find discrepancies in Laura's personnel file, had found something else entirely. Shell company. Kickbacks filtering through a consulting firm that existed only on paper. 17 unnecessary procedures over the past 2 years, each one authorized by Caldwell, each one billing insurance at inflated rates, each one feeding money back into accounts registered to names of board members. And 2 of those unnecessary procedures had caused patient complications. 1 permanent disability. 1 death. Caldwell's network, the thing he'd built so carefully, started unraveling that afternoon. The board members weren't taking his calls. The hospital's legal team was already conferencing with federal prosecutors. The FBI was being called in. By evening, Dr. Caldwell understood that his own investigation had turned into a guillotine, and he was standing directly underneath it. 6 months later, Laura stood at the glass doors of Seattle General and watched Dr. Caldwell sitting at a folding table in the parking lot of a strip mall urgent care in South Atlanta. He wore a polo shirt with an insurance company logo stitched over the pocket. His nameplate read, Steve. His hands trembled as he handed out pamphlets about supplemental coverage to anyone walking by, most of whom ignored him. Most of whom didn't recognize him. Most of whom would never know he'd once been somebody. A few people did recognize him. She could see it in their faces. The way they turned away. The way they hurried past without acknowledging he existed. Inside the trauma bay, Marcus Chen walked the hallways in his dress blues, his bearing already changing as his body healed. The challenge coin Laura had pressed into his hand back in Bagram, the one that had seen dust, blood, and 14 years of deployments, was now mounted in a glass case in the lobby. The plaque beneath it read simply, Master Chief Petty Officer Laura Bennett, when others will not. New nurses asked about it every week. What does the plaque mean? Who is Master Chief Bennett? And the older nurses would tell them the story. Not the classified parts, those stayed classified. But the parts that mattered. The parts about choosing integrity when convenience was easier. About showing up. About not walking away from people who needed you, even when walking away was the only smart choice. Laura stood in front of that plaque one afternoon during her shift, hand steady as she adjusted an 4-line for a trauma patient in Bay 2. Her daughter Emma stood beside her, old enough now to understand that her mother's job mattered. That sometimes the quietest people in a room were holding everything together with nothing but their hands and their refusal to break. The trembling wasn't fear. It was restraint. It was 8 years of military service compressed into the body of someone the world thought was just a nurse. It was the weight of decisions made at 2 in the morning with mortar fire in the distance. It was the choice to save lives in scrubs instead of a uniform, in hospitals instead of compounds, one patient at a time. Emma looked up at the plaque. At the name. At the story written in that single phrase, when others will not. Is that you? She asked. Laura placed a hand on her daughter's shoulder. That's all of us, she said quietly. Whenever we decide to stay when it would be easier to leave. A trauma alert came through the intercom. Bay 3. Incoming. Laura squeezed Emma's hand once, then turned back toward the doors where the next emergency was waiting. Where someone else's impossible moment was about to begin. She moved with the kind of calm that only comes from having already survived the worst. From knowing that some fights don't end with victories or medals. Some fights end with showing up. With steady hands and a refusal to look away. If you've ever seen someone underestimated and proven everyone wrong, drop a comment. And if you haven't subscribed yet, the algorithm's been quiet, but you already know the kind of stories we tell here. Hit that subscribe button. Share this with someone who needs to know that the quietest person in the room might just be the one holding it all together.